The day my stepmother called me useless was the day she lost everything. It was late June in Kansas City, the air heavy with humidity that clung to the walls like regret. I remember the slow creak of the front door as I came home from work still wearing my gray Summit engineering uniform. The sun was sinking behind the neighbors' fences, turning every window in our quiet cul-de-sac into a mirror that showed me a version of myself I barely recognized. Tired, obedient, invisible. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and opened my banking app, a reflex I had developed since I started saving to move out. The balance was zero, not missing a few dollars, not a glitch, completely empty. $15,000 gone, the sum of 3 years of extra shifts, skipped vacations, and quiet discipline. My throat went dry. I scrolled through the transactions, each withdrawal, stamped with the same signature, Moore Interiors, LLC. My father's widow, Diane, had opened that company a year ago. She called it her second chance. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred, then walked down the hall. She was in the living room sipping white wine, scrolling on her tablet, the air conditioner humming above her like a machine that didn't care. "Diane," I said carefully, "did you move money from my account?" She looked up, not surprised, not even pretending to think. "Family money isn't yours to keep. I used it for the house. You should be grateful I let you stay here rent-free." I could feel my heartbeat in my palms. That was my savings. I worked for it. She smiled, that slow, cold curve that always made me feel 10 years old again. "You're so dramatic, Elena. You'll never amount to anything. Useless, just like your mother." The words hit harder than I expected, sharp and deliberate, designed to draw blood without leaving a mark. I wanted to shout to demand she return every cent, but my voice caught in my chest. She turned back to her tablet like the conversation was over. In that instant, something inside me shifted. It wasn't rage exactly. It was the quiet certainty that this woman would never change and that waiting for fairness was a waste of oxygen. I left the room without slamming the door, which somehow made her angrier than if I had. Behind me, she called out, "Don't sulk, Elena. Grow up." I walked outside barefoot, the pavement still warm from the day, and sat on the front steps watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. I could still hear her voice through the open window laughing on the phone, probably telling someone how ungrateful I was. A dog barked down the block. Fireflies blinked between the hedges. It was the most ordinary summer night, and yet I knew my life had just split in two, before and after that sentence. She called me useless, but she had no idea what I was capable of when cornered. The house behind me glowed with the steady light of her arrogance. She thought control was safety, that keeping me small kept her powerful. But power built on theft is never stable. I remember whispering to myself almost like a promise, "You'll pay for this, but not the way you expect." I didn't know yet that karma keeps receipts. The next morning, I would wake up in a rented room across the river with nothing but my laptop and a folder of bank statements. I would discover what she had really done with that money and who she had done it with. And I would learn that revenge doesn't always require violence. Sometimes it only takes proof and patience. Have you ever been insulted by someone who thought they would never need you, because that's exactly how this began? 3 years before that night, I had promised my father I would keep the house running until the mortgage was paid. He had been sick for months, and during his last week, he made me swear to take care of Diane. I believed him when he said she would need me. After his funeral, the house in Kansas City felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened with grief. Diane moved through it like she owned every inch of it, rearranging furniture, throwing away my mother's old photographs, and painting the kitchen walls a sterile shade of cream. She said it was time to start over, but what she really meant was time to erase. I went back to work at Summit Engineering 2 weeks after the funeral. The office lights were harsh and the coffee tasted metallic, but at least numbers made sense when people didn't. Every Friday, I transferred $200 into a separate savings account. It was my quiet plan to leave once the mortgage was settled. Diane didn't know about it, or at least I thought she didn't. She insisted on handling all mail and utility payments, saying she didn't want me to stress. At first, it sounded like kindness. Then the credit card bills started coming in her name with my charges on them. She told me it was easier to keep everything under one account. I wanted to believe her. For 3 years, she managed every household expense, even my paychecks. She said combining finances was what families did. Whenever I hesitated to hand over a document, her voice softened into something that sounded like concern. "You're too trusting, Elena. Let me handle it before you make a mistake." I learned to nod. It was easier than arguing. The house became her kingdom, and I was the tenant who paid rent in silence. By the spring of 2023, I had saved enough to move out. $15,000 wasn't much, but it was mine. I kept the account hidden, no online notifications, no shared access, just a paper statement locked in my desk. I imagined signing a lease, painting my own kitchen, waking up without hearing her footsteps. Then in early June, she asked for my laptop password, saying she needed to print a tax form. I told her I could do it myself, but she laughed. "Elena, you make everything complicated." I handed it over without thinking. 2 days later, my account was empty. That evening, she was in the dining room sorting envelopes, humming softly. I held the bank statement in my hand like a piece of evidence. "You took my money," I said. She didn't flinch. Family money doesn't belong to one person. The house needed it. Her voice was calm, almost bored. I told her that was theft. She said, "You should be thanking me for using it wisely." My chest tightened. "You had no right." She looked at me as if I were a child interrupting her. "You really don't understand gratitude, do you? You're just like your mother, always whining, never achieving." The phone in her hand slipped as she gestured, and it hit the edge of the table before crashing to the floor. She glared at me as if I had done it. "Look what you made me do," she snapped. "You're a freeloader, a useless, worthless freeloader." The words echoed in the space between us. My throat closed. I could smell the faint citrus of her perfume mixed with the burnt dust from the air vent. For a moment, I thought I might scream. Instead, I set the bank statement on the table and turned toward the hallway. She shouted something behind me, something about how my father would be ashamed, but I barely heard it. My ears rang with the sound of my own heartbeat. Outside, the rain had started again, slow at first, and then heavier, washing the driveway into ripples. I stood under the porch light, clutching my laptop bag. Inside the house, her voice rose and fell, muffled by the storm. Every word blurred into one thought: she had stolen my father's memory, my mother's dignity, and now the last thing that belonged to me. I looked at the dark street and thought about calling someone, maybe Tanya from work, maybe the bank, but shame kept my phone in my pocket. I didn't want to explain how I had let this happen, how I had stayed this long. When lightning flashed across the sky, it illuminated the reflection of the house windows. I could see her silhouette still moving inside, phone pressed to her ear, probably complaining about how ungrateful I was. I walked to my car without an umbrella, the rain soaking through my blouse in seconds. The driver's seat smelled like old coffee and fabric cleaner. I turned the key, but for a long moment I didn't move. The windshield blurred, and the streetlights turned into streaks of gold. I thought about my father sitting in the same driveway years ago, telling me Diane just needed time to heal, that she wasn't a bad person, just lonely. He had believed that kindness could fix cruelty. When I finally pulled out, the tires hissed on the wet pavement. The neighborhood was quiet except for the storm. Each house looked peaceful, lit by the soft glow of living rooms where other families probably shared dinner and laughter. Mine had become a war zone built on paperwork and guilt. By the time I reached the city bridge, my hands had stopped shaking. I didn't have a plan, but I had distance, and for the first time in years, that felt like power. The rain kept falling, and with it, something inside me started to wash away too, the need to justify the fear of leaving the hope that she might ever treat me like family. I whispered my father's name once, not as a prayer, but as a promise. This would not end with me running. It would end with truth. The night swallowed the sound of the car as I drove toward the faint glow of downtown Kansas City, the windshield wipers keeping time with a thought that wouldn't stop repeating in my head. She called me worthless. I was about to prove her wrong. The first week after I left felt like drifting through static. I rented a small room in Overland Park, Kansas, 30 minutes from the house I no longer called home. It was behind a bakery that opened before dawn, so every morning the smell of rising dough and burnt sugar slipped through the thin walls. The room had one window facing the parking lot and a mattress that sank in the middle, but it was mine. I stacked my few belongings on the dresser, opened my laptop, and stared at the login screen for minutes before typing. My savings account was still empty. My checking balance was $83. The silence pressed against me like another layer of air. I kept hearing her words, replaying them at random moments. "You will never amount to anything. Useless." I would whisper back to no one I worked for every cent, and she called it family contribution. Some nights I slept sitting up, afraid that if I lay down, the thoughts would drown me. At work, I pretended nothing had happened. Tanya Blake, who sat 2 cubicles away, noticed the puffiness around my eyes. She was older than me, mid-40s, with the kind of practical kindness that didn't need to be said aloud. During lunch breaks, she would split her sandwich in half and leave one piece on my desk without comment. On Friday, she finally asked, "You moved out, didn't you?" I nodded. She asked why, and I told her about the money. Her eyebrows lifted. "You need to file a report, Elena. That's theft." I said I couldn't not yet. She looked at me for a long moment. "You think protecting her protects your father's memory? It doesn't." I wanted to argue, but the words died in my throat. Family shame was a quiet kind of prison. That night, I walked to the gas station down the street, bought a cup of instant coffee, and sat on the curb watching cars glide through the intersection. The neon lights flickered, reflecting on wet pavement from an earlier drizzle. I thought about how easily Diane could turn everything upside down and still sleep. She probably believed I had learned my lesson. I wondered if she even missed my silence. 3 days later, an email arrived from the bank. It said there had been unusual activity associated with my personal identification number and asked me to confirm if I had authorized a transfer to Moore Interiors, LLC. My stomach dropped. The message included the transaction record $15,000 labeled as internal transfer authorization. The sender's information matched my own, except for one letter in the middle of my name. It was the kind of alteration someone made to avoid flagging. I stared at it until my vision blurred, then reread it again. She had not only taken the money, but had created a false digital identity to make it appear as if I had done it. I called the customer service line and waited through hold music that sounded like cheap optimism. When a representative finally answered, I explained the situation carefully, choosing every word as if I were building a case. The man on the line asked if I recognized the business. I told him I did, that it was my stepmother's company. He hesitated. "Ma'am, in that case, we'll need to open a fraud investigation. It might take several weeks." He offered to send me the forms by email. I thanked him and hung up. For several minutes, I just sat there, the laptop humming softly. I had spent years watching her manipulate my father with the same patience she used now. She never yelled, never cursed. She just rewrote reality until everyone else doubted their own memory. Tanya knocked on my apartment door that evening with 2 cups of soup. She took one look at me and said, "She did it again, didn't she?" I nodded. I told her about the email and the fake identity. She exhaled slowly. "You can't let this go. You're not saving anyone by staying quiet." I said something about not wanting the neighbors or her friends to read about it, about the embarrassment. She shook her head. "Shame is what people like her use to keep you in check." She left the soup on my table and told me to call her tomorrow. I ate it cold. When I couldn't sleep, I searched for Moore Interiors LLC online. The company had a simple website showing stock photos of staged living rooms and slogans about trust and craftsmanship. The address listed was the same as my father's old home office. At the bottom of the page, there was a section that read, "Local Partnerships and Government Projects." A link led to a short news clip from a local business fair showing Diane smiling beside a city banner. She wore pearls that used to belong to my mother. The caption read, "Entrepreneur of the Year nominee." I kept staring at the screen. Beneath her name were the words, "Founded 2020." I opened another tab and typed the company name into the Missouri Business Registry. The search returned one active result: registered agent Diane Moore, filed taxes none reported. I clicked through the documents until I reached a scanned form bearing her signature and a line that read, "Business Purpose Contract Interior Design Services." My heartbeat slowed as the realization formed. She'd used my money to fund a company that hadn't paid a single cent in taxes for 3 years. Outside the bakery's back alley, a truck was unloading flour sacks, the sound echoing through the walls like distant thunder. I turned off the light and sat in the dark with the laptop still open, its glow washing across the room. The smell of bread drifted in sweet and hollow. I thought about how my father used to say truth has its own timing, that when people build lies, they always forget one small detail. Diane had left too many details. The false identity, the unregistered taxes, the connection between the house and the business address. They were threads, and I suddenly understood I could follow them. Before closing the laptop, I looked again at the picture of her from the article. She was smiling like she had already won. I whispered to the empty room, "You used my savings to buy your mask. Let's see how long it stays on." The cursor blinked on the screen, a small pulse of light waiting for me to move. I opened a blank document and titled it, "Notes for Future Reference." It was the first time I wrote something that wasn't about escaping, but about fighting back. When dawn came, the bakery opened and the scent of yeast filled the air again. I hadn't slept. I poured coffee into a chipped mug and watched the sun rise over the parking lot. My phone buzzed with a new email notification. The subject line read, "Account Verification Follow-Up." It contained one line that made my hands tremble. "Please confirm whether the transaction recipient Moore Interiors LLC is related to you by family or employment." I read it twice, then opened a new browser tab. If I wanted answers, I had to start with the company itself. I typed the name into the search bar and added one more word at the end: fraud. The more I searched, the more Diane's world began to take shape, not as a family, but as an operation. I remembered how she had handled everything after my father died. He had left her a modest insurance payout and a few remaining contracts from his accounting work, yet within months, she had expanded her spending beyond reason. She opened credit cards in both their names, took out a home equity loan, and insisted it was all for repairs. My father, exhausted from chemotherapy, nodded along. He believed she was saving them from debt. I watched as she turned him into a dependent one bill at a time. When he hesitated to sign papers, she would smile sweetly and say, "You are too tired, let me manage it." By the end of that year, his personal account was empty and everything flowed through hers. He never knew what she had done, and I had been too afraid to question it. Now looking at her company records, I saw the same pattern written in digital ink. The next Monday, I met Tanya for lunch in the cafeteria. She noticed the dark circles under my eyes and said, "You've been digging, haven't you?" I told her everything I had found so far. She listened quietly, then took a bite of her salad. "You can track her business legally," she said. "If you know the company's EIN or tax ID, you can pull filings. You work in accounting. You know how to read ledgers better than anyone." Her calmness steadied me. That evening, I stayed late at the office pretending to reconcile spreadsheets while I used the company computer to access public databases. The Missouri Secretary of State website listed Moore Interiors LLC with an employer identification number that matched several invoices I had seen on her site. I copied it and ran it through a public contract database. Within seconds, rows of numbers appeared on the screen. She had submitted bids for municipal projects under her company's name. One of them was a renovation contract for the Kansas City Community Center worth more than $200,000. The date of funding approval matched the month she drained my account. I stared at the screen until the edges of the numbers blurred. It was no longer about stolen savings. She had used my money as collateral, claiming it was investor capital. Every lie she told had turned into public funding taxpayer money built on fraud. The irony made me almost laugh. My father's honest work had funded Diane's empire of deceit. I printed every document I could find: filings, contracts, city correspondence. The printer hummed steadily, spitting out pages of proof. I slipped them into a folder labeled More Interiors Documentation. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the clarity of finally seeing the whole structure. Tanya joined me as I packed the folder. "You look like someone who just found the last piece of a puzzle," I said softly. "She didn't just steal my money, she used it to commit fraud." Tanya's eyebrows lifted. "You can take this to the auditors, Elena." "This is real." I hesitated. Part of me still felt that invisible leash of family loyalty tugging at my wrist. She saw it and added, "If she were a stranger, you'd report her without a second thought. Why should blood change the definition of wrong?" Her words stayed with me long after she left. At home, or what passed as home, I spread the documents on the bed. Each page was a vein in the body of her deception. I followed them backward, tracing the signatures, the mismatched addresses, the recycled project descriptions. The company's listed accountant was a man named Greg Wilkins, a former contractor whose license had been revoked 2 years earlier for falsifying estimates. He had been fined, but never jailed. Diane had hired him, probably knowing his record would make him easy to control. I opened another file, and my pulse quickened when I saw a scanned check signed by her with my father's old digital signature next to hers. It was dated a month after his death. I whispered into the empty room she forged him. Saying it aloud made it real. The bakery below me rattled with the sound of trays being stacked, and for a moment I felt dizzy from the weight of it all. I closed my eyes and pictured her sitting in that cream-painted living room sipping wine while she told her friends how hard she had worked to rebuild her life. She wore my mother's pearls to every event, smiling for cameras that loved a story about resilience. I wondered how many people had clapped for her without knowing they were applauding a thief. The next morning, I printed the last of the records and took them to work in my bag. Tanya met me by the elevator and said quietly, "There's someone you should talk to." She introduced me to Marcus Reed, a deputy auditor she knew from a professional workshop. He was in his late 30s, polite but serious, the kind of man who listened before speaking. I handed him the folder and waited as he flipped through the pages. After a few minutes, he said, "This looks substantial. We can verify through procurement records. If what you're saying is true, this isn't just theft, it's municipal fraud." The word fraud sounded heavy final. He looked at me over the folder. "Do you want to move forward with this? Officially?" My throat tightened. I wanted justice, but also feared what exposing her would do to my father's memory. Marcus seemed to sense my hesitation. Sometimes protecting the truth means letting go of the version of family we were taught to protect. That night, I sat by the small window of my rented room, the folder on my lap. The bakery had closed hours ago, leaving only the hum of refrigerators below. I thought about my father's voice, the way he used to say that numbers don't lie, only people do. I realized the documents in my hands were my father's unspoken revenge evidence that the honesty he lived by would outlast her deceit. I placed the folder in my bag and whispered, "Tomorrow." The sky outside turned pale gray, the color of metal before dawn. My hands no longer shook. The decision had already been made. I poured coffee and watched the first commuters drive past. Their headlights cut across the parking lot like thin ribbons of light. I wondered how many of them carried quiet wars inside their homes, how many stayed silent because they feared being called ungrateful. The question hung in the air as I packed the folder. Would you stay quiet if someone stole your future and wore it like a crown? The following Friday, I drove to the Jackson County Records Office with the folder sitting on the passenger seat, like a passenger who would not speak. The morning was overcast and the air smelled faintly of wet concrete. The building was old and square, its stone steps worn smooth by decades of people seeking proof of something. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered above rows of filing cabinets. I told the clerk at the counter that I needed access to public procurement records for Moore Interiors, LLC. She asked for my identification, copied the number into her system, and handed me a visitor badge. "Computer number 3, she said without looking up. The room was cold and silent except for the low hum of machines. I typed the company name into the search bar and waited. The results loaded one by one, each line a trail of signatures and dates. My stomach tightened when I saw it. Moore and Partners, not Moore Interiors. The difference was small, just a few letters, but the listed address matched Diane's home office. I clicked the entry and opened the PDF. The document showed a signed contract for renovation services at the Kansas City Community Center. Estimated value $212,000. The signature line made my pulse stop. It read Diane Moore, Managing Partner, Moore and Partners. Next to her name was another in faint digital ink, Arlo Gardner, Senior Financial Advisor, my father's name, dated 6 months after his death. I stared at it until the screen blurred. The signature had been copied from old files I recognized from his computer, the same looping G, the same slightly uneven spacing. I whispered to myself, "You forged him again." My hand trembled as I printed the pages, each sheet sliding out warm and damning. I was halfway through when a voice behind me said, "You must be Elena." I turned. It was Marcus Reed, the deputy auditor Tanya had introduced me to. He wore a gray suit and carried a folder tucked under one arm. His tone was steady, professional, but his eyes softened when he saw my expression. Tanya called. "Said you might need guidance." I handed him the contract. He read quietly for a long moment, then nodded once. "I worked with your father. He was one of the most meticulous auditors I've met." He tapped the signature. "This isn't his work. He never signed digital copies without a chain of custody." I swallowed hard. "She used his name to win city contracts." He nodded again. "We've had suspicions. There were discrepancies in her bid forms and an unverified financial declaration. Your evidence could complete what we're missing." We sat at a metal table near the window, the morning light spilling across the papers. He asked me to describe how I obtained the documents. I told him everything from the email alert to the forged identity to the account transfer. He took notes methodically, never interrupting. When I finished, he closed the folder. "Elena, this goes beyond family theft. It's procurement fraud, falsified records, and potentially wire fraud if she used electronic signatures across state lines." The words landed like stones. I asked quietly, "What happens now?" He said, "If you're willing, we can open an official inquiry through the Treasury Fraud Division. But once we do, you can't withdraw it. There will be interviews, statements, subpoenas. Your stepmother will know it came from you." The thought made my throat close. For a moment, I could see her face the disbelief that would turn into fury. I imagined her calling me ungrateful again, accusing me of betrayal. Marcus leaned forward slightly. "You're not responsible for her crimes. You're responsible for what you choose to do after seeing them." His words reminded me of something my father once said while teaching me to reconcile accounts. Numbers tell the truth, but people decide what to do with it. I looked out the window. The clouds had thinned, and a strip of pale sunlight cut across the courthouse steps. "Do you think she knows you're investigating?" I asked. Marcus smiled faintly. "She knows someone is, not who." He gathered the documents, slid them into a new envelope, and said, "I'll file these as preliminary evidence, but we'll need a statement from you if this goes forward." I hesitated. I'm not sure if I'm ready for revenge or for justice. He nodded as if he understood the difference too well. They often start from the same place. The question is where you want it to end. His voice was calm, but there was a trace of empathy under it, the kind that comes from seeing too many families torn by greed. I thought of my father again, his quiet patience, the way he used to say that truth never needed defending, only revealing. We walked out together into the hallway. The buzz of printers and low voices followed us. He gave me his card. "If you decide to proceed, call me directly. No intermediaries." I held it like a ticket I wasn't sure I wanted to use. Outside, the air had warmed. The sun reflected off the parked cars, bright enough to make me squint. Marcus paused by his sedan. Whatever you choose, Elena, make sure it's for you, not against her." Then he drove away, leaving a faint trace of dust behind. I stood on the steps holding the envelope of copies. People passed by carrying lunch bags and briefcases, their lives unconnected to mine, but I felt the strange pull of decision. I could walk away and let her keep her empire, or I could finish what my father had unknowingly started. I opened the folder one last time and looked at the forged signature. The loop of the G in Gardner curved just enough to expose where she had copied it from another document. She wasn't careful, only confident. That confidence had been her armor for years, the reason she believed she could humiliate me without consequence. I folded the paper carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and whispered the question that had been circling my mind since morning. Do I want revenge or do I want justice? The answer came slowly, quiet, but certain. I want the truth to stand where her lies had lived. When I stepped off the courthouse stairs, I nodded once to myself. It was the smallest movement, but it felt like the first honest signature I had ever written. The next week unfolded like the slow tightening of a knot. Marcus called on Tuesday morning, his tone clipped, but calm. He said the Treasury Fraud Division had provisionally accepted the evidence package and needed a full internal report. "We will use Form 41B, he explained. It documents whistleblower evidence before it becomes a public record. You will need to summarize every transaction, every file, and how you obtained it. Accuracy matters more than speed." I took notes while he spoke, writing his words like equations I had to balance. After we hung up, I stared at the notepad for a long time. The weight of what I was doing settled deeper. This was no longer a private act of defiance. It was the beginning of a legal storm that could tear open everything Diane had built. That night, I gathered my files on the narrow table in my apartment. The folder of printed contracts lay beside my laptop. I opened my bank account records and cross-referenced each withdrawal with the dates from her invoices. The numbers aligned too perfectly to be coincidence. She had transferred $15,000 from my account on June 12th. On June 14th, her company deposited the same amount as seed capital for the city contract. I printed the statement labeling it Exhibit A. Next, I sorted through her email archives I had saved from a shared cloud folder back when we used the same household computer. I found messages from her to contractors, written in her cheerful corporate tone, promising early payment once funds were cleared. Attached were invoices with fake signatures from non-existent suppliers. Every detail confirmed the same story: fraud disguised as efficiency. By Friday, my desk looked like a crime board. I built the report carefully, attaching screenshots, digital copies, and handwritten notes linking the patterns. I added my personal statement at the end, describing how she had forged my father's signature and used stolen funds as operational capital. When I emailed the draft to Marcus, he called back within an hour. "This is solid," he said. "But to finalize it, we need internal correspondence. From her current system, proof that she directed the falsifications. Do you still have access to her office?" I hesitated. "Not officially," I said, "but she keeps everything in the same house." There was a long pause before he said, "If you can retrieve those files safely, it would strengthen the case beyond dispute." That night, I sat in my car outside the old house, the windows fogging as the summer air cooled. The lights were on inside. Through the sheer curtains, I could see her silhouette moving across the living room. She looked unchanged, confident, untouched by the quiet war I was waging. I had texted her earlier, pretending to reconcile, saying I wanted to collect a few of Dad's documents from the study. Her reply came quickly. "Of course. Family should stay united." It made my stomach turn. I walked to the door and rang the bell. She opened it wearing that same fixed smile as if our last conversation had never happened. "Elena," she said brightly, "you look tired. Life on your own not so easy, is it?" I forced a small smile. "I came to pick up some old files from Dad's desk, work-related." She waved her hand toward the hallway. "Go ahead. Just don't make a mess." The house smelled the same, a mix of lemon cleaner and stale wine. My father's study was still neat, every shelf dusted. I took a slow breath and plugged a small USB stick into her laptop on the desk. It was a data logger Marcus had given me. It would automatically copy recent financial files once connected. I turned on the screen and pretended to search for old folders while it worked. From the living room, I heard her voice calling, "Find what you need." I said yes, my throat tight. The USB light blinked rapidly as files transferred in silence. She appeared in the doorway holding a glass of wine. "You know," she said, "I always wanted us to get along. But you were so distant, so judgmental. I did what I had to do to keep this house. Your father would have understood." I looked up, forcing calm into my voice. "Maybe he would have, but I do not." She laughed softly. "You never understood responsibility. That money helped this family. You act like I stole your crown jewels." I turned back to the screen, watching the progress bar reach 90%. My pulse thudded against my ribs. "You used it for business," I said evenly. "Yes," she replied, "and it paid off. You should be thanking me for turning something useless into something valuable." The absurdity of her words almost made me smile. The woman who had called me worthless had stolen from me to fund her image of worth. I closed the laptop and removed the USB, slipping it into my pocket. "I found what I needed," I said. She gave a dismissive wave. "Good. Try not to bring your drama here again." As I walked toward the door, her voice followed me, light and casual. "Next time, come for dinner. We can talk like adults." I didn't answer. The screen door shut behind me with a sound sharper than I intended. In the car, I held the USB between my fingers. It was warm from the computer, small enough to hide but heavy with truth. I plugged it into my laptop to confirm. Folders filled the screen, timestamps, spreadsheets, and internal emails with attachments. One subject line read Project 47B, Financial Adjustments Pending Approval. Inside was a chain of messages where Diane instructed Greg Wilkins to alter bid reports before submission. Her exact words, "Ensure margins reflect compliance. Delete any notes," referencing outside funding. I exhaled slowly, the air trembling out of me. This was it. The missing link, the proof she had built her empire on a foundation of lies. When I sent a sample of the files to Marcus later that night, his reply came in minutes. "This changes everything. Secure the original device. We will initiate the fraud protocol first thing Monday." I closed my laptop and sat in the dark. The city outside was quiet, the faint hum of traffic rising like a low tide. My reflection in the window looked unfamiliar, sharper somehow. I realized that the fear that had kept me obedient was gone, replaced by something steadier, colder, more precise. Diane thought she had buried the evidence deep inside her computer. She had no idea her own files were about to testify. 1 week later, the Kansas City Business Expo filled the convention hall on Bartle Boulevard. The printed program listed local woman entrepreneur, and below the title sat Diane Moore, founder of Moore and Partners. The name looked official in bold serif type. In my bag rested the USB that held her own words and numbers. I told him I planned to. I said I had updated slides for the keynote. She asked for a drive. I handed the USB across my open palm and watched her nod as if this happened every hour. I stood 2 rows back, far enough to see the screen and the podium, close enough to hear the air change. The jazz trio ended with a soft chord. The lights cooled to a steady blue. The host welcomed the crowd and praised the courage of local founders. Cameras from the local station drifted like quiet bees near the aisle. Diane waited just off stage. I could see the curve of her pearl earrings and the pleased tilt of her chin. When they called her name, she walked into the light and accepted a glass plaque that threw shards of brightness onto the curtains. She thanked the room for believing in second chances. She thanked sponsors and the city. She thanked her late husband for inspiring her devotion to service. She lifted her chin and began the story she loved to tell about rebuilding from nothing. Behind her, the screen flickered. A slide appeared, then changed to a live window filled with columns of numbers. People leaned forward. Phones appeared. The host looked toward the stage manager with a frown. I kept my hands at my sides and breathed. A new document replaced the transfer. It was an email thread. Diane to Greg Wilkins. Ensure margins reflect compliance. Delete any notes referencing outside funding. The room drew a collective breath. Someone whispered that this must be a mistake. A reporter stood and raised a camera. Diane tried to speak, but the microphone captured only a thin sound. The next image filled the screen, not a slide, but a scan of a contract. Kansas City Community Center renovation. Managing partner Diane Moore. Senior financial advisor Arlo Gardner. The signature under my father's name carried the same loop and spacing I had seen on grocery checks when I was a child, copied so perfectly it betrayed the copier. The date was 6 months after his funeral. A woman in the third row covered her mouth. The host stepped to the podium and said there seemed to be a technical issue, but the screen kept going. It showed a tax questionnaire listing 0 employees for Moore and partners, while an open spreadsheet in the corner displayed payroll forecasts. It showed a payment request sent to a shell supplier with a residential address that matched our old home office. It showed a calendar reminder to reprint invoices without donor notation. The murmurs thickened into something heavier. Diane turned toward the projection, then back to the audience, the practiced smile leaking away. She said the slides were out of order. A man near the aisle said the slides looked like evidence. The stage manager froze by the curtain eyes on the feed. The host tried to pivot, but the next image appeared on its own. Bank transfer authorization. Account holder Elena Moore. Recipient Moore Interiors, LLC. The line item was my savings, and the date matched the day the account drained. Someone gasped loud enough to echo. I could feel the heat of the stage lights, even from the second row. The host asked for a break. The screen refused. It opened another email. Please route initial capital through internal account to avoid questions during audit. That line was bold at the top of the thread. Greg replied, confirmed. Diane replied, good. The reporter in the aisle snapped photos in a fast stutter. The cameraman from local news leaned in hard. Diane gripped the plaque until her knuckles turned paper white. She said the files were fabricated by a disgruntled former employee. A voice from the back asked which dead man had signed the contract. The room went very quiet. I stepped into the aisle and walked toward the front. People noticed, but no one moved to stop me. On the screen, a procurement portal login sat open with her username visible. A cursor flashed like a heartbeat. I reached the foot of the stage and looked up at her. She opened her mouth to speak and nothing came out. My voice was steady. You called me useless. Turns out I am very useful to the state attorney. Phones rose like a forest. The host tried to take the microphone from Diane, but she held it with a shaking hand and said there would be an explanation later. The projection answered for her. It showed a checklist labeled Project Adjustments with a note beside it in her tone. Remove donor references. Align totals. Ensure no outside funds are visible. The host finally cut the audio. The stage manager killed the house music. The jazz trio stared at their instruments as if sound itself had become dangerous. An official from the city office stepped onto the stage and spoke into a handheld mic, his voice calm and firm. He said the presentation would pause for verification. He asked that attendees remain seated while staff secured the equipment. The screens went black for the first time that afternoon. For a breath, the room was soundless. Then the crowd erupted. Reporters moved like a tide. People turned to each other to confirm what they had seen. The official guided Diane toward the wings, but cameras caught the pallor of her face and the tremor in her grip. I stood at the foot of the stage and waited. The stage manager returned the USB to me with a small nod that said more than words. She whispered that the feed had mirrored from the drive automatically. I thanked her and slipped it into my bag. As security ushered people toward the lobby, I felt the quiet return to my bones. It was not relief, it was precision. Outside in the atrium, the chatter bounced against glass and steel. A reporter approached and asked my name. I gave it. He asked if the files were mine. I said the numbers where the choices were not. He scribbled that down. The official came over and asked me to stay for a statement. I agreed. Through the glass wall, I could see the skyline burning in late afternoon light. It looked clean and exact against a pale sky. I thought of my father and of the way he used to say that truth speaks best when nobody shouts. A security guard opened a side door, and the cool air moved across the atrium like a tide coming in. Someone asked if I regretted doing this in public. I looked at the closed doors of the hall and at the faces lined with shock and something like recognition. I said what I believed. Private theft thrives in silence. Public light is the antidote. The guard led me to a small room near the loading dock where the city official and the station producer waited with recorders. I sat, answered questions in order, and handed over a duplicate of the files. When I stepped back into the corridor, the expo had thinned. Booths stood under dim lights. Vacuum cleaners whined in the distance. I walked toward the exit and the cameras followed for a few steps, then stopped. Outside, the sun dipped behind the convention center, and shadows stretched along the sidewalk. I tightened my grip on the bag and let the evening settle over me like a vow. Would you have done the same if it was your money, your name, your life? By morning, the headlines had spread faster than I expected. The Kansas City Star printed more interiors under investigation for fraud across its business section in heavy black type. The online article showed a photo from the expo, Diane frozen mid-sentence, with the projection of her forged signature looming behind her. The story quoted the city's statement confirming an audit and included my single line from the interview. "This is not revenge, it is accountability." I read it twice, then turned off my phone. Outside my window, the bakery lights flickered on the smell of dough rolling upward. Life went on around me, indifferent but cleaner somehow. By noon, the story had reached national wires. Local radio replayed snippets from the expo, each segment cutting off just before my face appeared. Reporters called my office, but I stayed quiet. Marcus texted that the Treasury team had executed a warrant for Diane's corporate and personal records. The police and IRS were coordinating the inspection. When I asked if I should be present, he replied simply, "No. You have already spoken loudly enough." That afternoon, I parked near the house and watched from across the street as two unmarked sedans and a government van stopped in the driveway. Agents stepped out wearing jackets with block letters on their backs. One carried a camera, another, a box of sealed envelopes. They knocked once, and Diane opened the door wearing a white blouse and pearls, as if preparing for an interview. She tried to smile, but the movement froze when they handed her the warrant. The agents entered. Within minutes, they began carrying out boxes labeled Moore and Partners Financial. I saw one of them lift the same laptop I had used to pull the files. Diane stood on the porch, arguing with a woman who wrote notes on a clipboard. I could not hear the words, only the tremor in her shoulders. When they placed her into the back seat of the sedan, her hands folded tightly in front of her, I felt neither triumph nor pity. It was simply the end of a long equation balancing itself. The news cameras arrived before the vehicles pulled away. By evening, the footage was everywhere. Local CBS called my office requesting a comment. Tanya found me at my desk and said softly, "If you do not speak, others will fill the silence for you." I agreed to meet the reporter in the studio's downtown office. The lights were harsh, but the interviewer's tone gentle. She asked what I wanted people to understand. I looked at the lens and said, "This is not revenge. It is accountability." She built her success on stolen work and stolen names. I just made sure those names could speak again. The clip aired that night between weather and sports. My phone buzzed for hours, messages from coworkers, strangers, and one from Marcus that simply said, "Proud of your clarity." Over the next few days, more voices joined the noise. Former contractors stepped forward claiming unpaid balances. 2 employees from her company described falsified payroll forms. A supplier confirmed that Moore and Partners had issued duplicate invoices for the same materials. Each story added another layer to the structure of her downfall. The local paper published an editorial about systemic fraud in small business contracting. The city froze her accounts pending review. By midweek, every contract under her company name was suspended. The elegant website she had built now displayed a notice that read, "Temporarily unavailable." I spent most evenings in silence reading the updates without emotion. It was strange watching a life unravel in real time, one headline at a time. Tanya came by one night with takeout and said, "She will try to blame you." I nodded. "Letter. The truth has receipts." She smiled sadly. "You sound like your father." That was the first time his name felt like strength instead of memory. On Thursday, Marcus called to confirm she was being held for questioning. The Treasury Division had traced multiple transfers tied to municipal funds and verified that her declared capital matched the theft from my account. He said the prosecutors would likely file charges within the week. "You will be notified if you are needed to testify," he said. I thanked him. He paused before hanging up. "For what it's worth, Elena, your father's old colleagues remember his integrity. You honored it." That night, I drove past the old neighborhood. The house stood dark except for the faint glow of a porch light someone had forgotten to turn off. The lawn was overgrown. The once pristine driveway looked narrower. I sat in the car for a while, listening to the quiet hum of the streetlights. Across the street, a child rode a bike in circles, his laughter echoing faintly. It felt like another life. When I got home, my email was full of messages from strangers. Some thanked me for exposing corruption. Others shared their own stories of family betrayal. One line stayed with me. "You gave people like us permission to stop being silent." I read it twice, then closed the laptop. I realized that silence had been Diane's favorite tool. She had counted on it to protect her, to isolate me, to keep the truth buried under respectability. Now that silence belonged to me, and I had filled it with proof. The next morning, the Kansas City Star ran another headline. "Moore Interior's owner faces federal and state charges." Underneath was a subheading that read, "Assets frozen pending investigation." The accompanying photo showed Diane leaving the courthouse, sunglasses covering her eyes, her once immaculate hair pulled back without polish. Behind her, 2 agents carried sealed boxes. I traced the caption with my finger. It felt distant, almost unreal. That same night, the evening news aired the footage of her final statement outside the courthouse. Her voice shook as she said she had been misunderstood, that she only wanted to build something beautiful. The reporter noted that her attorney refused to comment. The segment ended with a shot of the courthouse dome against the night sky. The anchor's voice carried a quiet finality. Investigators confirmed multiple financial irregularities, further charges expected. I turned off the television and sat in the dim light of the apartment. The bakery downstairs had closed early, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator. I thought about the word everything, how it used to mean the house, the company, the image she had guarded. It now meant the absence of all those things. She had gambled on greed and lost more than money. That same night, she truly lost everything. 2 months passed before I saw her again. Autumn had settled over Kansas City, the air cooler, the trees lining Main Street turning bronze and gold. I had learned to breathe in long silences, the kind that come after a storm has moved on, but before the ground dries. The Arlo Gardner Foundation had just opened its small downtown office, a narrow space above a legal aid clinic. Tanya ran operations, and Marcus volunteered as our advisor for compliance cases. We helped workers file claims for unpaid wages, nothing glamorous but real. I had not thought of Diane in weeks, at least not consciously. Then one Tuesday afternoon, she walked through the glass doors as if she still owned the air around her. The receptionist froze. Diane looked thinner. Her makeup washed out her clothes, expensive but ill-fitted, as if borrowed from a version of herself that no longer existed. When she saw me standing by the file cabinet, her eyes filled too quickly. She crossed the room before I could speak and gripped my hands. Her skin was cold, trembling. "Elena, please, I just needed to talk to you," she said, voice cracking under practiced sorrow. I looked at her and felt an echo of the old instinct to comfort, but it passed. I gestured toward the conference room. 5 minutes, I said. She sat across from me, clutching a tissue she hadn't used yet. They froze everything she whispered, the accounts, the house, even the car title. I'm living in a friend's spare room. I don't know how to survive this. Her words fell like stones into water designed to create ripples of guilt. I stayed silent. They said you're cooperating with the state, she continued. You could withdraw your statement. You could tell them it was a misunderstanding. She leaned forward. Families should stick together. The phrase made something sharp rise in my chest. I looked at her steadily. Family doesn't steal futures, I said. She blinked as if the sentence had struck her. You think I meant to hurt you? I was trying to hold everything together. You have no idea what pressure I was under. Her voice trembled, then broke into a sob. Your father left so much chaos, so many debts. I fixed it. I made sure his name stayed respectable. She wiped her eyes and looked up at me, searching for softness. You could still help me, Elena. I can give you back part of what I took. We can settle this privately. You'll have security and I'll have peace. I almost laughed at the word peace. You want me to trade the truth for comfort, I said quietly. You taught me value through loss. I'm keeping the lesson. She flinched, then reached across the table as if she could still command me. You're destroying your own blood, she said sharply. This will follow you forever. People will call you vindictive. I stood, pushing the chair back slowly. They can call me whatever they want. At least I can look in the mirror. Her voice rose desperate now. You think these people care about you? They're using you. When this is over, you'll be alone again, and you'll realize family was all you had. I walked to the window. The rain had started soft at first, a gray curtain over the street. Reporters had gathered near the entrance downstairs, waiting for her next court date. Their umbrellas dotted the sidewalk like dark blossoms. If you're worried about being alone, I said, without turning, you should have thought about that before you forged a dead man's name. The tissue in her hand shredded between her fingers. I loved him, she said. You'll never understand what it's like to watch someone die and know you're not enough to save them. The sudden honesty in her tone caught me off guard. For a second, I saw the exhaustion beneath her vanity, the emptiness she had tried to fill with control. But empathy does not erase accountability. I faced her fully. I watched him die too, I said softly. The difference is, I didn't use it as an excuse to steal. She stood slowly, eyes wet, mascara, bleeding into faint streaks. You're cruel, she whispered. You sound just like them. I picked up the folder on the table and closed it. No, I said. I sound like someone who finally stopped apologizing for surviving you. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The rain outside deepened thunder low in the distance. Diane straightened her coat, gathered the shreds of her tissue, and walked to the door. At the threshold, she paused. You think this ends with me? She said. But you'll spend the rest of your life proving you were right. That's its own kind of prison. I met her gaze and replied, Freedom has its price. I paid mine. She opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The receptionist avoided her eyes. Outside, camera flashes ignited through the glass as she reached the sidewalk. She hadn't brought an umbrella. Reporters shouted questions, microphones thrust forward. She kept walking, the rain flattening her hair against her face, her steps slow and heavy. Each flash caught her expression, part defiance, part disbelief. The woman who once commanded rooms now looked small against the city's gray light. I watched until she disappeared into the blur of traffic and umbrellas. For a moment, I wondered if she felt the cold. The way I did that night, I left the house when the rain soaked through my clothes and I had nothing but an empty account and a plan. I imagined her replaying every decision, realizing too late that control is a currency that always devalues. Tanya entered the room quietly and asked if I was all right. I nodded. She wanted me to withdraw the statement I said. Tanya sighed. Of course she did. People like her never believe consequences apply to them. We stood by the window together, watching the last of the cameras pack up. The rain softened to drizzle. Somewhere below, a reporter dictated her closing line. Diane Moore declined to comment. I closed the blinds and turned off the light. "It's strange," I said. "When you finally stop being afraid, the silence feels louder than the noise ever did." Tanya smiled faintly. "That's what peace sounds like." Outside, the rain faded to mist and the city lights reflected in puddles across the street. I locked the office door and slipped the keys into my pocket. Diane's words still echoed faintly in my mind, but they no longer carried weight. They were just the sound of a story ending. I stepped into the quiet hallway and felt the calm settle around me like new armor. The storm had passed. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and nerves. It was November in Jackson County, the kind of cold that turned breaths visible as we waited outside before the hearing began. Reporters clustered near the entrance, their voices low but charged. Cameras clicked each time the heavy doors opened. Inside, the ceiling arched high, lined with fluorescent lights that made everything too bright. The judge's bench stood at the far end, raised like a quiet mountain of authority. When Diane entered, flanked by her attorney, the room shifted. She wore a navy suit, her hair pinned back neatly as if control could still be stitched into fabric. She didn't look at me, not once. The clerk read the charges in a steady monotone. Wire fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. The words seemed to hang in the air like visible dust, each one landing on the surface of her silence. I sat behind the prosecution table waiting for my name to be called. Marcus sat 2 rows behind me, a silent anchor. The state's attorney, a man named Robert Vance, began by presenting the timeline of her company's contracts. Each exhibit appeared on the monitor for the jury: the forged signature, the falsified invoices, the transaction log, linking my savings account to her business. The chain of proof stretched unbroken, meticulous. When he read the date, June 14th, aloud, my throat tightened. That number had lived in my mind like a scar. When it was my turn, I walked to the witness stand. The bailiff swore me in. The wood of the rail felt cool under my fingertips. Robert asked me to explain how I discovered the missing money. I told him about the night I checked my balance, about the confrontation in the living room, about her words, "useless, just like your mother." My voice trembled once but steadied quickly. I described the investigation, the evidence, the forged contracts. He asked what motivated me to report it. I said quietly, "Because truth is the only inheritance my father left me, and I couldn't watch her sell it." A few jurors shifted in their seats. One woman nodded almost imperceptibly. When the defense began cross-examination, Diane's lawyer leaned on the podium, trying to soften the edges. He asked if I loved my father. I said yes. He asked if Diane loved him. I said I couldn't speak for her. He asked if it was possible she had taken the money to protect the family business, to keep the mortgage afloat. "She told you she was helping, didn't she?" he said. I looked at him, then at Diane, and answered, "She told me I should be grateful she let me stay in my own home." He pressed on. "Isn't it true that you were angry after your father's death, that you may have misunderstood her intentions?" I kept my eyes on the judge. I understood perfectly. She forged his name and stole mine. There's no misunderstanding in arithmetic. When the prosecution resumed, Robert presented the visual timeline of the transfers. The screen displayed each amount, each date, and finally the total, $15,000. He looked at the jury and said, "This number began the story, but it does not end it." He advanced to the next slide, showing the cumulative fraud uncovered through Elena's evidence. $48,000 in diverted funds, unpaid taxes, and false reporting. He turned to Diane. "You called this family management. The law calls it theft." Diane shifted her composure, cracking slightly. The defense tried to recover. They called Diane to the stand. She spoke in measured tones, her hands folded neatly. "I was just helping her save," she said, her voice almost tender. She was young, careless with money. "I wanted to ensure stability. I never meant harm." The room stayed silent except for the scratching of pens. Robert stood and asked, "Then why did you sign her father's name 6 months after he passed away?" Diane's mouth opened, but no sound came. The attorney beside her whispered something, but she stared at the monitor displaying the forged contract. Robert's voice softened, not cruel, but final. Helping someone save does not require a counterfeit signature. When the closing arguments ended, the judge called a recess. I stepped into the hallway, my heartbeat loud in my ears. Marcus handed me a cup of water. "You did well," he said. "You didn't need anger. You had facts." I nodded but couldn't speak. The truth had weight even when spoken calmly. After 30 minutes, the jury returned. 12 faces unreadable but composed. The foreperson handed a folded sheet to the bailiff, who gave it to the judge. Time stretched thin as he read the verdict aloud. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom exhaled collectively. Diane's shoulders sank, her eyes darting toward the ceiling as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. The judge began the sentencing. His voice was steady, deliberate. For the crimes of wire fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion, this court sentences the defendant to 7 years in federal custody and restitution of $48,000 to cover direct and collateral damages. Diane's hand went to her mouth. Her attorney tried to whisper again, but she didn't move. The judge continued. This case illustrates the erosion of trust within families when greed replaces integrity. Reporters hurried toward the exit, calling editors. The sound of cameras outside grew louder as the bailiff escorted her away. Her pearl earrings glinted once under the fluorescent light before disappearing behind the courtroom door. I stayed seated, unable to move. The judge dismissed the room and people began to file out. Marcus touched my shoulder lightly. "It's done," he said. Outside the courthouse steps were crowded with journalists. Flashbulbs popped as the police car pulled from the curb. The photo that would appear in the evening edition captured her mid-stride hand, shielding her face hair blown by wind. The caption would read, "Stepmother's greed ends in jail." I stood at the top of the steps watching the car turn the corner. For the first time since the night she emptied my account, I felt no urge to look back. The November air cut clean against my skin. Across the street, leaves gathered in small piles, pushed by passing tires. I thought of my father again, his quiet belief that truth was a long game, and I realized the board had finally cleared. I whispered to myself, not for the cameras, not for the crowd, but for the man who had taught me patience. Justice is not loud. It is simply accurate. Winter arrived quietly that year, the kind of cold that made the city lights shimmer sharper against the sky. The courthouse headlines faded from the front page, replaced by new scandals, new names. But for me, life didn't return to what it was before. It became something steadier, quieter, purposeful. When the restitution payment cleared in late December, $48,000 deposited into my account from the Federal Recovery Fund, I didn't feel triumph. I felt responsibility. That money carried every scar of the fight it came from. It didn't belong in a vault. It needed to move to repair what greed had broken. I sat with Marcus and Tanya in the small office above the legal aid clinic, where the air smelled faintly of old coffee and printer ink. The space had once been a tailor's shop. A single window overlooked the city square where people rushed past, wrapped in scarves and purpose. We talked for hours about what to do next. Tanya suggested a scholarship fund for young accountants pursuing ethics training. Marcus proposed a legal assistance line for financial abuse survivors. I listened, fingers wrapped around a paper cup of lukewarm coffee, and finally said, "What if it's both? What if we build something that teaches and defends?" They looked at each other and nodded slowly. We called it the More Justice Initiative, not for her name, but for what it should have meant all along. The irony was deliberate and honest. The fund started small, $15,000 from the restitution, and an additional contribution from a local civic grant Marcus helped us secure. Our mission was simple: to help women reclaim autonomy after financial control or fraud within families. We partnered with local accountants, lawyers, and volunteers from the city's university. Tanya designed the branding herself, pale blue letters, over a white background with the tagline, "Reclaim what's yours." By spring, we held our first workshop in a community center in Independence, Missouri. 27 women showed up, some with notebooks, others just listening. We named the program Financial Freedom After Family Control. I opened with a simple sentence that carried more truth than I expected. When they take your money, they think they own your silence. They don't. The room fell quiet in that heavy, shared way only truth can create. Afterward, one woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said her husband had used her credit for years, leaving her with debt and no record of ownership. She asked how to start again. I told her the same thing I had told myself months earlier. Start small, start honest, but start. The program grew faster than I anticipated. Local radio stations invited me for short interviews. Universities reached out asking if I would guest lecture. When I spoke at the University of Kansas that May, the auditorium lights cast everything in a warm gold hue. The students were quiet, watching, waiting for something more than numbers. I told them about control disguised as care, about how silence becomes a tool of manipulation, about rebuilding without bitterness. I said justice isn't about punishment, it's about restoration. A professor later told me that line became part of their ethics syllabus. At night, when the office emptied, I stayed to file reports and send thank you letters to donors. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the window and hardly recognized myself. The woman looking back was older by more than time. She carried clarity. Diane's sentencing was over her name now, another court record archived in the system. She had appealed once unsuccessfully. The last update Marcus forwarded to me said she was serving her term at the Federal Correctional Facility in Aliceville, Alabama. I didn't feel relief or regret, just closure. Tanya often joked that our office had become too serious, so she brought in a small speaker that played soft piano music while we worked. One evening, the melody drifted through the room as I read a thank you email from a woman who had attended our workshop. She wrote, "You didn't just give me tools, you gave me permission to exist again." I reread it 3 times, the words sinking deep. The world had taught me that money was power, but it took losing mine to realize that truth, once spoken, is stronger currency. We began expanding the program, teaching financial safety planning and digital privacy. Marcus trained volunteers on how to identify forged documents and coercive debt patterns. Tanya built an online resource hub so that victims across states could access our guides. Each new project felt like adding a brick to something solid and lasting. I no longer thought of revenge or validation. Those belonged to the past. What remained was purpose. One afternoon, a film student from the university asked if she could record our session for a documentary on justice reform. I agreed, reluctantly. She filmed the workshop, capturing faces, voices, and the energy of survival. When she edited the footage, she invited me to record a voiceover. I sat in the studio with headphones on the soft piano score playing beneath my words. "If you've ever been told you're useless," I said into the mic, "prove them wrong. Quietly, legally, permanently." When the final cut premiered at a local festival, the audience applauded quietly, thoughtfully, the way people do when something strikes too close. In early summer, we received an anonymous donation of $20,000. The note attached read, "For the daughter who didn't stay silent." Marcus smiled when he saw it. "You're reaching people you'll never meet," he said. I nodded, thinking of all the women still trapped behind polite facades and joint bank accounts they didn't control. Every life touched by what we built felt like a small act of repair, a counterweight to the damage Diane had caused. Sometimes I walked by the old house now listed for sale again. The paint had peeled, the garden gone wild. It looked smaller than I remembered, almost harmless. I stood across the street once, hands in my coat pockets, and whispered a quiet goodbye. Not to her, but to the version of myself who once needed her approval. When I locked the office that night, the city hummed softly below. Lights shimmered on wet pavement and the cold air felt clean. I looked up at the sign above our door, the blue letters glowing faintly in the dark. The More Justice Initiative. It no longer felt ironic. It felt right. The story had circled back to where it should have begun, not with loss, but with rebuilding. I turned off the lights, the piano melody still echoing faintly in my mind, and walked home knowing that this time every step belonged entirely to me. 1 year later, the city had changed, though maybe it was just me seeing it differently. Kansas City moved with its usual rhythm morning traffic, winding along the river lights, flickering on at dusk. The courthouse that once loomed in my memory now looked like any other building, its windows dull under winter light. The world had kept turning, as it always does after a storm. Diane was serving her sentence at Aliceville, Alabama. Every few months a letter arrived in my mailbox, written in her tight, familiar script. The first time I saw her handwriting again, my stomach clenched the way it used to before an argument. Inside was a single page that began with, "My dear Elena," and ended with, "Please forgive me." I read it once slowly, the words careful, rehearsed, almost sterile. She wrote about regret, about misunderstanding, about how prison was teaching her humility. Not once did she mention my father's name. When I finished, I folded the paper neatly and placed it in the drawer beside my desk between the legal folders and old receipts. I never replied. More letters followed, some shorter, some longer, all circling the same hollow apology. I stopped opening them after the third one. They piled up like thin ghosts of a voice I no longer needed to hear. Forgiveness, I had learned, was not something owed. It was something released. She had taken enough from me. She would not take my piece, too. The More Justice Initiative had grown quietly over the year. We had expanded to 3 neighboring counties, running workshops and clinics twice a month. Tanya managed logistics, now her efficiency a steady hum in the background of every project. Marcus, officially retired from the state, came by weekly to advise new cases. We worked with survivors of financial abuse, people who had signed documents they didn't understand, or whose partners drained joint accounts under the guise of protection. Every story echoed pieces of my own, though none exactly the same. Sometimes after a session ended, I would sit alone and think of the women who walked in carrying shame and left carrying clarity. Each of them reminded me that justice is not about punishment. It is about restoration. In February, the university invited me to speak again, this time at a larger auditorium. The banner outside read, "Rebuilding After Betrayal." I stood on stage in a gray dress, the lights warm on my face. My voice no longer trembled when I spoke of Diane or of what she did. Instead, I told the audience what came after. I told them how I rebuilt from the silence she left behind, how accountability became a kind of peace. At the end of the talk, a student asked if I had ever forgiven her. I paused before answering. I don't think forgiveness always looks like what we imagine, I said. Sometimes it's not a conversation. Sometimes it's choosing to stop carrying their weight. The room was silent for a long moment before the applause began. That night, I walked home through the quiet streets. Snow had fallen earlier, thin layers melting along the curbs. The city skyline glowed faintly, reflections trembling on the river. I crossed Liberty Memorial Bridge, my breath white against the cold air. From there, I could see everything, the courthouse dome, the downtown lights, the faint shimmer of traffic heading west. Kansas City looked both vast and intimate, like a memory I was finally ready to keep. I leaned against the railing and closed my eyes for a moment. Somewhere behind me, the past remained sealed in folders, in verdicts, in letters I no longer opened. Ahead, the future stretched unhurried, uncomplicated, waiting to be built. A soft wind rose from the river, carrying the scent of rain. I thought about my father again, about how he used to say that justice is slow because truth takes time to walk upright. For the first time, I understood. The pain had settled into something calm, not erased, but transformed. The part of me that had once been a victim had become an architect, designing a life grounded in its own integrity. When I turned back toward downtown, I noticed a couple walking hand in hand along the bridge, their laughter faint but clear. It reminded me that life continues in ordinary, unremarkable ways, even after extraordinary pain. I smiled slightly, tucked my hands into my coat pockets, and started walking again. At home, the apartment was quiet. The small plant on my windowsill had grown taller, leaning toward the light. I sat at my desk, opened my journal, and wrote a single line. Justice is not the fall of the guilty, but the rise of the honest. I closed the book and placed it beside the drawer where Diane's letters rested untouched. The drawer stayed closed. Some stories don't need a reply. The clock struck 9. Outside, the skyline shimmered brighter, the river reflecting streaks of gold and silver. The world had moved on, and so had I. There was no dramatic ending, no revenge left to savor, only balance, the quiet kind that settles after the noise fades. Before going to bed, I walked to the balcony and looked out at the city once more. The bridge lights stretched across the water like a line of small lanterns. I whispered softly, "I made it, Dad." It wasn't about winning. It was about surviving well enough to give others a map out of their own storms. The wind brushed my hair, cold but gentle, as if in answer. Down below, a train horn sounded in the distance, steady and low, fading as it moved towards somewhere else. I watched until it disappeared from view. Then I went inside, turned off the lamp, and let the room rest in darkness. Justice had been served. Peace had followed quietly, as it always should.